Well, hello everyone. My name is Morgan Michelle Franklin, and I'm a clinical instructor in the Dispute Systems Design Clinic. And I'm so grateful to be joined in conversation with Elaine Lin Hering, who's the author of the forthcoming book, Unlearning Silence, and is also a former student and friend of the Dispute Systems Design Clinic. Hey, Elaine, how's it going?
It's good. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, so happy that you're here. I really enjoyed having the chance to, review and read your book, which I thought was so moving, and I'm really happy to be in conversation with you about it.
Hmm.
So why don't we go ahead and jump in? So I'd love to, for us to take about just a little bit of time and talk through some of the elements of this work, what led you to develop it,
Sure.
what it's about, and some of the big pieces of it. So first, for those who might hear the title and wonder
Hmm.
what it's all about, I wonder if you might tell us, what does this book mean to you and what is it about for you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a joy to reconnect because my journey with voice and silence and negotiation really started when I was a student in the clinical program. And having steeped myself in getting to yes and difficult conversations, and after law school, teaching this material across continents and industries in a leadership development capacity. All of that is actually what brought me to Unlearning Silence. So, one of the questions that we most often get around difficult conversations is, can I really say that? Can I really say that to my colleague, to my boss, right? We're no longer in an academic environment. There are real stakes to whether I say something. And the advice that I heard and that for many years I gave was essentially a Nike version of just do it. If you need to speak up, you need to have more confidence. You have to need have more courage. Here are some great Harvard approved ways of doing that. And while many of those strategies were useful, I would also notice people who read the books, took the courses, and still wouldn't negotiate, still wouldn't have the difficult conversations. And I started to wonder why. And what I landed on was making the connection to another body of work that organizational behaviorists look at called employee silence and organizational silence. Essentially, why do we withhold our thoughts and feelings? And if we really want to be able to capture the insight, the perspectives that we need from our colleagues and our organizations, we actually need to look at the role that silence plays in each of our own leadership and life, the ways that we silence the people around us, and of course, the ways that it's baked into the systems that we're part of. So, unlearning silence is an attempt to have a more accurate diagnosis to what is often presented as a problem of people not speaking up.
Hmm. Thank you for that, Elaine. And just thinking about, okay, so really as you started to engage this material here and then you continue to think about it as your career progressed, how did you make the transition between it being something that you thought a great deal about to deciding, okay, this is something that I want to provide some structure for,
Mhm.
and get into producing this material?
Absolutely. Everyone says that writing a book turns you inside out. I will say that in my limited data set of writing one book, writing a book on unlearning silence while unlearning your own silence feels next level. But as a student, you see other lecturers, professors producing content, putting books out there. And I always said, I'm not going to write unless I have something new and additive rather than another permutation of the seven elements of negotiation. And so when I came across silence and started to observe it, experiment with it with clients, I thought, this actually is additive. There is no commercial mainstream book on silence now. There are these research papers, there are academic papers, but if we look at how prolific and insidious silence is, this is something we should be talking about because that other diagnosis of people who aren't speaking up, people who aren't negotiating, the problem is them, is such a damaging frame, and I would argue an inaccurate frame on a broader systemic issue. So I wanted to give us language to talk about what's really going on here, right? I have a relationship with silence. I've learned it, probably benefited from it. As I interact with other people, because I'm human, I silence them despite my best intentions. And of course, if we look at our policies and practices, they tend to support and silence different perspectives. So, how do we be more honest and therefore more effective if we really care about a world in which belonging, dignity, and justice are true for every human being? We need to be able to diagnose it accurately and make choices accordingly.
Right. Thanks, Elaine. And this focus that you are insisting on, right? So having more of a global consideration of what leads to silence,
Mhm,
right? Instead of just thinking about the specific actor.
mm,
And love this language that you're using around, okay, we often encourage people to just be more confident, or to just have more courage.
mhm,
And what we know about confidence, right, is that it literally means self-trust, right? Do you trust yourself enough, to be able to engage in whatever you are navigating? Um, but there are so many different reasons why that trust might be invalidated systemically. And so being able to think about that is really important. Um, and so, speaking of the language that you thought, okay, well, let's really get some of this out here, I was so interested in the expansive concept of voice that
mhm,
you offer.
mhm,
Right? So sometimes when people think about voice, they might just think about it as, okay, what is someone saying?
mhm,
But in your definition, you think about it holistically and talk about things like when someone decides to show up in a space, or how they show up, or what language they're using. So I'd love for you, if you wouldn't mind, just to speak a little bit more about that expansive concept and how you think about voice now.
Yeah. So for those of us who have yet to read the book, let me do a good definition because we're at a law school, so we need to define our terms. So voice is to me is not just the words that we say in a meeting, but voice is how we move through the world. Again, looking at a more broad definition of what are we actually solving for. If the problem statement is simply Morgan isn't speaking up in the meeting, that's a really narrow focus of what we're trying to solve for, and there are tactical ideas about how to actually express your perspective in a meeting because meetings are such a typical context that we all find ourselves in. But if we think about why it matters to speak up or use our voice, it's really about impact in the world. How do we influence the outcome to a negotiation? How do we influence the outcome to a case? How do we impact the world? And we know that words are important, but are not the only factor here. So, that more expansive definition of how you move through the world, it is your words, it is your actions, it is how you show up. Um, Actually, just to me, gives a more accurate perspective of the ways that we impact the world. So much of how we silence other people isn't telling someone to say or be explicit about saying your thoughts and ideas don't matter. It usually is just that look that I give you in a meeting, and you internalize that. It may or may not be the message I intended to send, but if so much of communication is nonverbal, voice can't just be about the words that we say, but is really about how we show up in the world.
Right. Thanks for that, Elaine. And really appreciate that frame and that broader concept. And I just want to stick with voice
Mhm,
for a moment. So earlier you talked about writing this book about unlearning silence while also you were unlearning silence yourself.
mhm,
Um, and want to think about something you invite us to do in the book, which is interrogate the ways in which we learn silence,
mhm,
and really the habits that have come up around silence for us. Um, I love this quote. There's a book by psychologist BJ Fogg called Tiny Habits. And when he thinks about habits, he says often we use really harsh language to talk about
mhm,
ending a habit.
mhm,
But what if instead we thought about habits as knots? and we
Mhm.
just thought about unwinding
Mhm.
our habits. And so I would love it if you would talk to us a little bit about um, maybe what most surprised you or something that really um, impacted you as you were doing this unlearning silence work yourself and your own habits.
Yeah, this is such a personal question and answer that I'm happy to share. What surprised me the most is that I actually had something to offer,
Mm,
which, as a graduate of Harvard Law School, I mean, if you look at me from the outside, the credentials might suggest that I have authority and agency of my own. And yet, how many of us go through life deriving our value from our credentials or the roles that we play? It really is this stance of, am I, and I argue that this is true for law students and for each of us as human beings, are we allowed to interrogate the things that we believe and the patterns that we see in the systems, family system, organizational system that we're part of? Because I thought my effectiveness in the world came from teaching other people's content, right? Tried and true frameworks and tools that other people at our alma mater created. And who am I to be able to add to that canon? Is there something here? Could that come from me when I don't carry a lot of the dominant identities that many of these leaders carry? And so the whole journey has been, hey, I think I'm onto something. Let me test that out. It resonates with people. It seems to be impactful. What would it look like to turn this into a book, knowing that books are a way that ideas get out into the world? So, what was most surprising to me actually is that I had something to add. And I'd offer that as an invitation to anyone who is questioning their own worth or their own ability to add value, that each of us, because of our unique life experiences, are going to see the world differently and can make connections between ideas and people and systems that other people, because of their different life experiences and identities, cannot do. So, if I go back to my own learned silence, I am the youngest daughter of an immigrant family from Taiwan. I was brought up in the Christian church and told to turn the other cheek. A lot of the ways that we show up as quote unquote effective team members is to not rock the boat, is to be collaborative, meaning don't disagree or dissent. And from that, one of the damaging messages that you might internalize, that I certainly did, is that you're only here for your utility, the role that you can perform that is expected of you, rather than your humanity and your own insight. So the book is also an invitation to readers to say, what is your voice? If you had the agency, which I'd argue that you do, to show up in the world as you intend, what choices might you make? That could actually be exactly the way that you're showing up now. But if we're going to make sure we're not just moving through the world on autopilot, but being really intentional about the impact we want to have on the people in the world around us, it is worth interrogating, what is my voice? How do I want to show up? What might I want to try differently? What assumptions might I hold now that I want to evolve? Or, as you say, unknot?
great. Um, Thank you for that, Elaine. So there's so many themes here that I feel like so many of us who navigate marginalized identities end up grappling with, as we do this sort of unwinding work. And we'll get into hopefully conversations about what it means to do your own work.
Mm,
But these themes around agency and worth and value and utilization, I think
mhm,
there are um, so many elements of that I think, it's really important for us to unwind as we think about what it means to be intentional and to use our voice thoughtfully. And so, to that, I wonder, um, you note in the text, and this is a quote from your book, the problem with being silenced is that you edit yourself before you even begin to speak. Um, and I feel like this feels so resonant with, examples that I've heard of people who have talked about the editing that's necessary or how you might think about moving through the world. And as you talked with people in doing your work for this book, I wonder when people think about the purpose of that editing, what were some, purposes that they talked about, and how did they perceive that editing work?
Yeah. Conformity.
Mm,
To fit in. If credibility comes from not sticking out, if being part of the team means that you are not othered, then there's a natural force. The Australians would say that this is tall poppy syndrome. You don't want to grow taller, the flower of the poppy, you don't want to grow taller than other people because you will be cut down. And we know from sociology and psychology that mimicry is such a strong force. And in fact, some books on influence suggest that if you want to influence people, you should act like them because people are more likely to want to work with, say yes to, and help people who look and sound like them. So if we think about the editing, one of the primary factors is to keep the peace, to conform, to blend in, particularly if you carry a marginalized identity, which means that you are more inherently othered and questioned within a social context. And so that editing, particularly if you have carried those marginalized identities your entire life, happens at the subconscious level. I often tell this story when I am speaking about being at a leadership development firm that I joined after law school and realizing that it wasn't until 10 years into being part of that team that I realized no one had ever used chopsticks before to eat their meal on a Zoom call. And there was no rule that said you can't use chopsticks on this team or in this organization. But if you don't see it done, you are inherently pushing for something different, which makes your role, your tenure seem more precarious. Now, we also know that difference is inherent to innovation, to the changes that we need to move our world forward in a different way to solve the most pressing problems. So, how do we invite that unique perspective and that difference? That's where the work in chapters 5 and I'd say 8 of the book of what are the ways that we silence other people, because most of us, I would believe, don't wake up in the morning intending to silence our colleagues, silence our families, silence the people we work with. But the ways that we show up unintentionally encourage that editing rather than inviting the candor and the difference of perspective.
um, I wonder, as we're talking and as I was reading your text, I kept thinking about all of these classes that I took in college, that I loved and adored, and just as a young feminist and a person who was beginning to think about what does it look like to use my voice,
Mm,
right? And how are there all of these ways in which we're taught to be silent
mm,
and silenced, and what is the difference between being silenced and
mm,
choosing silence? Um, I really appreciated hearing you or reading you talk about the benefits of silence.
mhm,
So in the text, you talk about, okay, there are certain benefits for staying silent. Silence allows for survival. It protects a person's energy, and it can be a form of self-care. You also noted in this section of the text that you were concerned about potentially empowering those
mhm,
who seek to silence others by presenting these benefits because they could be used for their purposes. And so I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about the benefits of
mhm,
silence,
mhm.
and then also just a bit about concerns that you had.
Yeah. I want to be clear that unlearning silence doesn't mean saying everything everywhere all the time. The world is too noisy and complex for that. But unlearning silence is being aware of the times that we feel the need to edit in order to keep our seat at the table. It is being aware of, are we choosing to withhold our thoughts and perspectives? Or is it that I have to withhold them in order to maintain that seat or have credibility or keep my job? To me, the difference between silence that is additive or oppressive is agency. Right? Do you have the agency to choose when and where and how you want to show up? Or are you having to perpetually fit into the roles and expectations that other people have of you based on your gender, your race, your education, fill in the blank? And that if we are perpetually expecting people to show up in the ways that we perceive them, which are often biased, we are silencing them, their uniqueness, what they bring, and also missing out on the insights that they offer.
In thinking about some of these benefits, you quote one of my favorite authors of all time, uh, Audre Lorde, in your text when you think about self-preservation. So, um, in the text, you talk about silence, and we'll come back to the agency piece. This is just raising so many questions for me, and so just thinking about which to pull on first. But with the self-preservation piece, you note that Audre Lorde says, "Your silence will not protect you."
Mhm.
Um, and while that's a true and fundamental tenet of this book, sometimes it's enough to preserve what's left of you to get you to the next day. Um, and then you then do the important work, though, of distinguishing between surviving and thriving. And you note that sometimes in silence or in self-preservation mode, and this is you say we walk around as shells of the people we could be.
Mhm.
And so I would love to hear you just speak a little bit about what you think we lose
Mhm.
staying in this self preservation space instead of shifting fully into this attempt to thrive.
Yeah, there are so many different layers to this, so we'll try to distill it. One of the downfalls of staying in self-preservation from a really physiological standpoint is it's unhealthy. Our bodies are not designed to chronically be on high alert, which is why that stress of having to self-censor, self-edit in order to stay sufficiently whole to go home, talk to your family, to get the brief done, to do, your day job means that it manifests in all sorts of health issues, hair loss, um, shortening one's lifespan, and the additional isolation of not being able to talk about it because everyone else seems to be doing just fine. Right? Everyone else, as a junior associate or as a partner, seems to be able to hack it. So why can't I? So there is a silence and a shame that we don't discuss those issues. So in the book, I call this being able to reduce the double pain. You may not be able to relieve the pressure of being a law firm partner. There are so many things about that system that are challenging, and the hours and the pressure to develop business. But you can, by in unlearning silence and having conversation about it, reduce the secondary pain of believing that you're the only one. And there's been a ton written by our Surgeon General and others about the epidemic of loneliness and isolation, if people want to dive deeper. So, one is just our physical health, the other is loss of potential, right? Why should the ability to fully develop your talents, bring those gifts, perspectives, skills, expertise to the table be limited just to those who carry dominant identities within a system? Hence the part of the subtitle of the book that says Unlearning Silence, How to Unleash Talent, right? There's that secondary impact of if we are requiring people to silence themselves in order to stay on our team, then we're missing out on the perspectives, the insights they could bring that often get ahead of and prevent so much headache, heartache. If we look at every corporate scandal of the last 100 years, there were people who tried to warn leadership. And a lot of those warnings were not heeded. And you see the fallout in great impact later. So there is the organizational impact, there is the talent impact, there's the personal health impact. And I would argue that from being able to live a fulfilling life, and this is where I get a little, if I'm watching myself from the balcony, I'm like, I am not an Instagram influencer. I am not a lifestyle person. I am a lawyer by training. Why am I talking about living a fulfilling life? And I also see suicide rates and burnout from my colleagues. So I think it's worth mentioning if you were constantly in self preservation, you are not able to live a full life, one that honors the needs, goals, hopes, and concerns. In classic negotiation speak, your interests, right? Your own interests. And so many of us, particularly high performing, particularly female, because we are acculturated to solve for everyone else's problems and needs other than our own, end up not getting our own needs met. So being able to use your voice is also, you cannot engage in self-advocacy if you are silencing your own needs and not using your own voice.
So in your text, you really separate the book into these two big areas. So first, there's awareness
Mhm,
as you think about, okay, what are the contours of this challenge?
mhm,
Why do we silence ourselves? How do other people silence us? How do we silence others? And then you shift into action in the second piece of the text. And so I'm wondering, at one point you say, if we've spent a lifetime channeling other voices and executing on their vision for our lives, how would we know what our own voice is?
mhm,
And so thinking about the shift into action, right, and this piece that you just raised around what does it mean to be acculturated to care for others and take care of others' interests, and find actually that it is valuable. Care is valuable and it is
mhm,
a worthy element of life. And to extend care to another person is a beautiful way of living. How do we think about locating with our own agency, think about prioritizing our own
mhm.
voice? What recommendation would you have for people as they're seeking to find their own voice?
I would actually go back first to classic negotiation advice. This is seven elements world from getting to yes, right? Every party to the negotiation has a set of interests, needs, goals, hopes, and concerns. And the shift is to remember that you yourself are a party to the negotiation. Therefore, you are not needy because you have needs. You are just a party to the negotiation. So that is a mindset shift to remember we are all players in our own negotiation and to not discount that, just like everyone else should be solving for our needs as well, our interests as well. Usually that's not happening. So we at least need to maintain the mindset and remember we have needs because we are a party to the negotiation. And if you are doubting whether you have a voice, because often if you're a junior associate or uh, have less longevity, less seniority with an organization, it can seem like, can I really say something? Right? I'm following leadership. I'm trying to read how things work here, figure out how things work here. And it doesn't seem like pushing against the grain is really going to serve me. The place I would start if you're doubting whether you have a voice is to ask two simple questions. They can be internal questions, so you don't even have to engage with other parties yet. But as you are listening to the conversation in a meeting, be asking yourself, what do I think? Just that simple question. What do I think? Not what does my manager think? Not if I'm a student, not what does my professor think? Not what does my mother think? But what do I think? And that question orients you back to, yeah, I have a different perspective. I have a perspective. I have a unique, arguably unique perspective. The second question would be in this moment, what do I need? Even just asking that, because if we are moving so quickly through the world, as so many of us are, juggling so many balls and responsibilities, we rarely stop to ask that question, which of course leads us back to the mindset piece of, yes, you have needs because you're a party to the negotiation.
Hmm. Um, Hearing you speak about this paradigm shift
Mm.
is such a, and it's such a powerful one to say, I am also in the negotiation, right? Like I am, in addition to doing this interest analysis that I'm doing for every other person who sits at this table, I am
Mhm.
also a party.
Mhm.
And so how do I think about these interests? I think that's incredibly powerful. And I wonder, as you think about the paradigms piece here, how do you think that stories of really internalized stories of worth and value of certain groups societally, how do you think that those stories impact the way that people see themselves
Mm.
as agential and as people who are worthy of having their interests analyzed?
This is the hard work of interrogating what messages might we have internalized? What assumptions might we subconsciously hold about who gets to speak, who has agency, who gets to have impact in the world? And it gets to the link of why representation matters, right? If, and I use an research from Hollywood in the book of just the percentage of female characters, speaking characters in mainstream movies for the last 20 years versus male characters, um, people who are not white, people who have different gender identities. Do we see them on the big screen? And what messages are subliminally being sent from something as seemingly innocuous as a movie? So the place I'd start is to notice, what are the assumptions I hold about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and to try to avoid the guilt or self-flagellation that can come with that sort of interrogation, to know that those messages are being sent to us from movies, from books, from our colleagues, not necessarily because they intend, but because we are swimming in this sea of silence, right? Ways that perspectives of who has voice, who should be heard. But what we can do if we don't want to live on autopilot is to interrogate that for ourselves. And also notice, and this is chapter 1 of the book, how we learned silence, right? It comes from our education, our school systems, it comes from our families of origin, it comes from interpersonal interactions, and then intrapersonal, the ways that we have internalized the messages over time. Um, and those stories are real. They are also negotiable. Just because that is what you believed or that was your MO up till now doesn't mean that it has to determine what happens tomorrow. And that's where the agency comes back in of what defined yesterday and today does not necessarily have to define tomorrow, because we each have the power and ability to disrupt those patterns by choosing different actions going forward. My hope with this book is a more accurate perspective on the problem. That's where we started with this conversation. The hope is that people like me who have long been silenced feel seen, known, and heard. If you carry marginalized identities and you move through the world in that way, it is very likely that you have been taught to stay silent, had to stay silent as a matter of survival, self preservation, self care, and also internalize that really damaging story that it's because you weren't good enough. If you could just be more, if you could have a deeper voice, if you could be more concise, if you could write like someone else, then you would be accepted. And that in my observation, experience, and research is just not the case. And so I wanted to give language for it's not because you're deficient, it's because you've learned and been silenced. And it is also a call to action and invitation. My secondary hope is that for those of us who are well intentioned leaders and want to have a positive impact in the world, which I'd argue is most people I meet, that we are better able to align our good intentions with the impact that we're having. Because I believe in my heart of hearts, we don't set out to silence people. And yet the ways that we show up often do. So my hope that it's that hope of being seen, known, and heard, and also being able to show up more as the leaders we aspire to be, rather than the leaders we often seem to be.
Mm. Well, I'll say, Elaine, you did answer my last question about about your purpose,
Sorry
and
to
I am
steal your
so
thunder.
no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Please, it is so powerful. I'm going to be sitting for a long while with this last piece that you raised, that it's not about courage necessarily, it's more about calculation.
Mhm,
And as we think about this calculation, really it happens within all of the different paradigms with which we live, right? And under which we move through the world. And so this piece around, how do you think about your purpose? And if
mm,
you are aligned in your purpose,
mhm,
how do you move forward within it? Um, and just connecting so much of this is about agency and intention. So if
mhm,
you have an intention yourself, and if voice is about moving through the world as intentionally as you possibly can, that feels like such a powerful way to think about all of this. Um, so really grateful. I just want to make space if there's anything that we haven't covered yet about the book or about your work that you'd love to share before we close. Would
mm.
love to give you that opportunity.
Yeah, let me underscore where you left us, which is we each have one life to live. And as we move through the world, we will inevitably impact the people around us, the organizations we're part of, and the community, the global community more broadly. So if we each have one life to live, how do you want to live it? And what impact do you want to have?
Hmm. Well, thank you so much, Elaine, for that. Thank you for making the time to be in conversation this afternoon. It's been a real treat. And thank you also for the work. I think it'll have, I hope, and I'm sure it will have a beautiful impact as it moves out into the world. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Morgan.